Hi guys, this is a Wednesday night, January the 8th, as I'm sitting here in my office here at home, and it's finally warmed up to I think the high 20s today. The last few days, the last weekend, has just been horrendously cold for Kentucky. We were down in the minus degrees during the days. It got to high 2 on Monday, I think, and so that's pretty unusual for us here in Kentucky. We usually have much warmer winters. But anyway, it's warming up, and just as I'm sure you're warming up to this class, if you haven't figured out by now as you read this book, which is probably the classic book on philosophy of religion, you're discovering that philosophers can say a lot of things and not say anything at all. Not a slam against philosophers in general, but as you read through this, I am suspecting that you're reading it many times just to understand what the author writes. Tonight we're going to look for just a few minutes because it's pretty complex, and the textbook really does do a pretty good job, and I'm going to have some YouTube videos I think will help explain further. But we're going to look at chapter 3, which is the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And the word cosmological comes from the Greek cosmos, which means world, logos, which means words. So cosmological refers to words about the world, or thoughts about the world. And the cosmological argument at its bare foundation says there has to have been a beginning. So if you go back in time, one can say, okay, the world was created. Okay, who created the world? Well, the universe produced the world. Okay, well, who produced the universe? So as you fall back across multiple levels of who created that, what created that, ultimately you come up with there can only be one thing. And this is what actually Islam came up with. It's called the Kalam argument, which the author talks about, and that is that there is an intelligent being, God, if you will, who has created everything that has come. Even today, the argument from those who argue from a cosmological standpoint say that everything comes from God. And now it takes different variations, different forms, but the bottom line is that in order for order to have existed, in other words, in order for our lives to be like it is, in order for us to have been created, and the world to have been created, and the universe to have been created, and atoms to have been created, and molecules to have been created, if you go all the way back, there has to be a starting point. And that starting point in the Kalam argument, and which many theists today argue, is God. So one of the common thoughts or phrases you'll hear is that God created ex nihilo, ex, this is Latin, nihilo, that God created from nothing, that nothing was. There was nothing. And yet there was a God. Who created God? God has always been. That's the argument. And so it stands to reason that, again, originating from Islam and then the Jewish people, Judaism, and Christianity all really come back to the same argument, that God must exist because there had to have been an intelligent beginner of all that is now. So in other words, things didn't just happen. Now, there are some philosophers who do argue that it just is, that something did cause it, but it doesn't have to be God. It could have been the Big Bang Theory. You know, my argument with the Big Bang Theory is, why was there a Big Bang Theory? I mean, why is there one? From what would cause a Big Bang? There had to have been something. So what some philosophers argue is that just pure physical, not resources, the pure physical cosmos caused this. In other words, their thought is, okay, there were things. How those things came about to be is irrelevant. But by the nature of the cosmos, there were things like atoms and molecules and all of that. And that through physical forces such as gravity and um, weight and mass and all those things, a Big Bang occurred in which the universe and all that is ultimately got created. Now, what's interesting about the cosmological argument, though, is how people bring it to God. In other words, the cosmological argument says, okay, everything must have had a starting point, so we reserve the right to say the very beginning was God who created all of these things. But there are some who would argue, okay, yes, we can go all the way back and say that there was something that created all that is. So many will argue and will reason that yes, there was a beginning and there was, yes, something that caused everything to be, but that it not necessarily have to be God. Now, as I think about that argument, my first thought is, who then? Or what then? If in fact there was an intelligent being who created all that we know, my argument is, why could it not be God? Now, some would say, well, why does it have to be God? And that's the argument you and I and others have to wrestle with. But it's interesting that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all agree, all go back to the very notion that there was an intelligent being. Is the Muslims call him Allah, and I use him not to be sexist or whatever. That's just how he's referred to. And Jews and Christians call him God. The cosmological argument is a very interesting one because it's difficult to argue against. How, in other words, if you don't believe that there was a God who created everything, that would imply probably that you don't believe in a God at all. Well, then you have to say one of two things. Either everything that is just happened by accident, or you can just say that everything has always been. That there doesn't necessarily have to be a beginning. That it has always just been. But if you look at our life experiences, there are beginnings to everything and ends to everything. Life. We begin and we end. This, I don't know if you can see it, but this plastic bottle my wife had at the desk. At one point, it did not exist. It was a bunch of chemicals. It did not exist as a bottle. It got created, and at some point it'll either get recycled or thrown in the garbage and will be destroyed, or perhaps crushed to where it no longer looks like or acts like or is perceived as a bottle, but the chemicals from it would be used to create another bottle. Cars, as much as I like cars and old cars, cars have beginnings, and most of them, all of them, eventually end. There's not a car that is kept forever. You may say, well, yeah, but I know somebody who has a Model A or a Model T. That's great. It's one of the first cars. But at some point, that car will go away. Either it will fall apart, it'll be wrecked, somebody will scrap it, something will happen to it. So for us, there is this concept of beginning and end. So if that's true, then why would it not make sense that there's a beginning and an end to the universe, and that an intelligent being created that? Now, some could argue that, yes, as I said earlier, that there was a beginning, but it doesn't necessarily have to be God. It could have been XYZ. It could have been ABC. It could have been called anything. But what I think is so very interesting is that you have three different faiths who all look at this independently and say it is God. It is an intelligent being who created from nothing everything that is. So what a philosopher would be arguing against in the cosmological argument is that Islam, Jewish folks, Christian folks, everyone's wrong. That somehow things just happen. Some nebulous thing happened. What's really interesting, I don't know if any of you guys watch like Discovery Channel or those kinds of things, but there's always, I find it fascinating because I watch some of these shows about how really everything like in the Bible is really related to aliens. I know you've heard that, like the wheels in the sky, I think in the book of Ezekiel. Some say those are flying saucers. The transfiguration of Jesus, for example, on the mountain, that in fact this turning white, bright colors and blinding was in fact an alien who caused Jesus to do that. In fact, I've even heard the argument that Jesus was an alien. It's really fascinating to me that someone is willing to believe that aliens from another world, another universe, another cosmos would come, intercede into time and history to do what we say God has done. Now, I'm not going to argue against the alien people, but my take on it is, why would you choose the aliens over a God? Why are the aliens an intelligent being and God not? And why would you choose to believe that aliens came from some place to which God was not? In other words, how did the aliens get created? So anyway, if you ever watch it, there's this one guy, he's a Greek guy, and he's written a bunch of books. I can't think of his name right off, but his hair sticks straight up about, it looks like about 12 inches off the top of his head, and he's got this fake looking tan. But he really truly believes and writes about the fact that aliens are really the ones who've caused things like the pyramids and Stonehenge, and all of this is reflected in the Bible through, like the Ark of the Covenant, where the Ten Commandment pieces were supposedly kept. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared, and no one knows where it's at. Well, the people who argue for the aliens would say, well, that's the aliens took them. I know that's kind of strange, but everything can be taken back to the aliens according to that worldview. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to chase that rabbit. The main thing I want you to get from this is that this chapter 3, is somewhat tough because he gets into several different versions, slightly different versions of the cosmological argument. As a matter of fact, he makes a statement somewhere in there that there's really more than one argument, that really he calls these cosmological arguments. And the best way to sum it up, and I would encourage you to do this, is go to the end of chapter 3, and what you'll see, let me find it here for you. On page 66 of your textbook, if I were you, before I began reading the first page of chapter 3, start with page 66 when it says Cosmological Arguments and God. And it's only a page and a half. Well, actually, it goes into just a little bit into page 68. Because what he does there is summarizes everything he's talked about. So read that, and then go back and start, and everything will make sense to you until you get to things like sufficient reasoning and those kinds of issues. But the bottom line is this, the cosmological argument says something, or in the case of theists, someone, namely God, created everything because there had to be a beginning. And something had to create from the beginning. Things just can't be. There has to have been a beginning of it. A great example, let me just share this with you, and then I'll let you go here. Years ago, a Toyota plant, the Toyota plant that makes Camrys, and now they make something else, is in Georgetown, Kentucky, which is probably 30 minutes from here. And when they first opened up, I was fortunate enough to get a tour of it. There was a group of us from work who got to tour the facility and see how they manage things and all of that. And what's really interesting is when you first start the tour, the only thing that's there are pieces of sheet metal. Actually, it's rolls of sheet metal. And by the time you got done with the tour, there was a Camry sitting there. So, in the beginning, there was rolls of sheet metal. At the end, there was a beautiful car. Cosmological argument says in the beginning there was nothing, but then God created, and now, at the end of the line, you have us. So, I would challenge you, as you think about this argument defending the existence of God, because this is what this is all about, defending the existence or non-existence of God. The cosmological argument is saying there is a God, there must be a God, because something, someone had to create from the beginning. Okay? Now, I hope this makes sense. I'm going to include some YouTube videos, which I think you'll find very interesting, that talk about the cosmological argument, perhaps more clearly than I did. But read the chapter very carefully, because it is important for you to understand that. And your first quiz will be over the first 3 chapters of the book. So, again, my quizzes, I'll send this out in an email. But bottom line is, my quizzes are not meant to trick you or to find some obscure point, but it's to make sure that you're understanding and grasping the main concepts of this philosophy of religion course. Okay? Well, thanks a lot, and I hope you have a good day or good evening. Bye-bye.